Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about neurotransmission. But what is neurotransmission? According to the Oxford Dictionary, neurotransmission is the transmission of nerve impulses between neurons or between a neuron and a muscle fiber or other structure. But what is a neuron? A neuron, also known as nerve cells, they are the building blocks that make up our nervous system. They consist of the same base makeup as our body's other cells, but there is something different. They have electrochemical process that allows them to transmit messages and information to each other. And there are four different types of neurons in our body, which are the bipolar interneuron, the unipolar sensory neuron, the multipolar motoneuron, and the pyramidal cell. So let's go over what the parts of the neuron are. So the parts of the neuron, no matter what type of neuron, so one of those four that I mentioned earlier, they will always be comprised of the same things, which are the soma, or the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. So before we go over what they are, let's look at a picture. So this would be the cell body, and this is the dendrite, and this is going to be the axon along here. So now let's get into what makes each one. So the soma is the cell body, as I mentioned earlier, and it is the life support of the neuron. So basically, if anything happens to it, it dies off, the neuron dies. And it contains the nucleus, DNA, mitochondria, and other things like that. The dendrites, which are these branchy-like structures, are actually named after a tree because of the branch and bushy-like appearance. They are the mailbox of the neuron, which means they receive messages and information from other neurons. They then relay the information to the soma, or the cell body. The axon, which is this long piece with these little branches at the end, they are the talker of the neuron. So essentially, they transmit the electrical impulses from the soma to other neurons, glands, or muscles. Depending on what type of neuron, it may have a myelin sheath. Well, what is a myelin sheath? Let's go over that next. So the myelin sheath is located along the axon of some neuron types. So not all neurons are going to have a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is a fatty tissue which acts as a protective layer. And this speeds up the transmission of electrical impulses along the axon. If it is degraded, which is seen in multiple sclerosis, otherwise known as MS, then this causes the degrading of messages, which leads to lack of muscle control. So next, let's talk about how does transmission work. So neurons will transmit signals, messages, either by sensory input stimulation, receiving a message, or being triggered by neighboring neurons. The dendrites, which are the branchy-like structure, they receive the signal, which then triggers the neuron's action potential. Action potential is the firing impulse, growth, and intensity. This then causes an electrical impulse charge to travel through the neuron, so from the dendrites where it receives the message to the cell body, which is the soma, down the axon to what is called the axon terminal branches. So that's where it reaches the tips of those. This signal is then sent out to other neurons. So what's a synapse? Let's go over that next. So this has to do with the transmission process, and the synapse is the contact point between two neurons. So they're located at the ends of the dendrites, which are the branchy-like structures, and the axon terminal branches get close, but they do not actually touch. They're about 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter away, I believe. And this space in between the axon terminal branches and the synapses is called the synaptic gap. The action potential in the sending neuron triggers the chemical messengers, which are neurotransmitters, to pass to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. So what happens to neurotransmitters after this process has occurred? Well, they're going to go into the receptor sites on the receiving neuron, but they do not stay bonded, so they don't stay there after. So once the message is received and triggers the action potential in the receiving neuron, the neurotransmitters essentially like pop out of the receptor sites and they are then reabsorbed to reuse by the neuron that initially released them. This process is called reuptake. So what are the different types of neurotransmitters? So they're either excitatory or inhibitory. So with excitatory neurotransmitters, they essentially rev up the neurons or make them excited and alert. This then increases the likelihood that the neuron will fire an action potential. And then on the other hand, inhibitory neurotransmitters make the neurons rest so they're at a more relaxed state, and this will decrease the likelihood that the neuron will fire an action potential. And then gamma aminobutyric acid is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. But some neurotransmitters can be both excitatory or inhibitory depending on what kind of neuron receptors that they encounter. So, neurotransmitters that can do both are acetylcholine and dopamine.